Next up, I'm going to invite Sasha, Tom, and Luke up if you want to make your way to the stage. And Justin Crump, obviously the CEO of Sibylline. But these guys are going to deliver the first presentation on intelligence. I will hand over now to the team. Do you want to come and take a seat up here, or you want to? Yeah, I think that'll be easier. Let people stare at you. Over to you guys.
Hide them in the corner, so we didn't have to get there stirred up.
I'll go right at the other side.
Fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Luke Brawn, and I am the Senior Embedded Operations Manager with Sibylline. Today, my colleagues and I are going to be talking to you about applying an intelligence-led approach to travel security, the value you can get from that, how we can look to do it, and how you can recommend to your clients to look to incorporate this. This is an area that Sibylline does a lot of, and this ranges from either our in-house intelligence team providing either single reporting or a sequence of reporting to support travel, or through our embedded function where we have teams directly embedded with our various clients to provide either intelligence support to broader security functions themselves, or actual travel intelligence and risk management programs themselves. So with me today, I've got Sasha, who is one of our embedded intelligence and threat monitoring team leads, and I've got Tom, who is from our in-house team and is our intelligence monitoring capabilities coordinator. They're going to go much more into really the use of strategic and tactical intelligence, how we can actually apply this, and how to just give you that concept of how this can be done for clients and how this can be utilized. What I'm going to try and talk to is initially set the scene with the broader value of intelligence. Why is it good to have an intelligence-led approach? And then what I'm going to really try and get into, and very much leading off Nick's point, how can we show value of this, both in monetary terms, but also more anecdotally and through other sort of metrics? How can we actually show that the nuance of predicting the future has value? Obviously, we're trying to stop things happening or prevent having to go into crisis response. How can we show that particular value? Oh, sorry. Break this. So what is the value of intelligence? And without being gimmicky, forewarned is forearmed. The whole point of this is to have that understanding of a changing threat landscape, different dynamics, and be able to focus resource, time, and money on the areas that matter, on the travel that is going to be higher risk, on the travel that's going to have broader impact. This also allows us to plan for contingencies from, and anyone with a military background will have heard of most likely to most dangerous courses of action, and anything that sits in between. What are the indicators and warnings of those things happening? What are the trigger events that are going to lead to those? And this is the whole point of being proactive rather than reactive, being able to go, okay, this event has happened, we've got a plan in place for that, and that plan has been supported by intelligence. We can look at what we need to happen within those sequence of trigger events and indicators. And ultimately, supporting the overall decision-making process, and that kind of binary question of should someone travel or should someone not? Should we go to these locations or should we not? And how does that change over time? Because that's obviously a dynamic process. So I'll break this down into a few different sections, and the first one I want to talk about is that proactive threat identification. Seeing around corners, seeing things before they happen, having an understanding of how things are going to change. Be that impact at the geopolitical level, be that on a much more local level. And as I said, Sasha and Tom are going to talk more to this later. I think we're all very much aware that the world is a very much day-to-day changing threat landscape at the moment, comparatively to 10, 20 years ago when things were slightly more static. We can see things for travellers change on a city and even street-by-street basis. And obviously having that foresight, that proactive threat identification, an intelligence team with an understanding of what business operations and travel is ongoing can really add value and be a force multiplier to go, hey, maybe we just need to send an alert, doesn't need to be anything too alarming, but they should avoid this area or maybe take an alternate route, up to potentially need to be having a discussion about removing people from country. So I want to talk about an example from my time when I was embedded myself and I was working with a tech client and overseeing an incident monitoring and response and support travel security function. We had a client employee who was in Sri Lanka. They were there for, and this is coming to Nick's point earlier as well, they were there for personal travel starting off, and we will talk to that kind of remote worker piece in one of the case studies later on. They were there for personal travel, but because they had turned on their work laptop, they'd obviously pinged up on our travel management system, and we were sat there going, why is someone in Sri Lanka? It's a little bit busy over there at the moment. So we reached out to this person, provided a pretty short summary intelligence update, and sort of basically ended with, look, we reckon this is going to go over the edge. We reckon leadership is going to fall, flights potentially cancelled, broader travel disruptions. What's your current plan? Do you have an alternate plan? As is often the case, and my background being intelligence in the military, the intelligence here was ignored by the traveller, and they were like, no, I know best, everything's fine in country. I don't have a chip on my shoulder about that at all, it's fine. So we went, okay, cool, we're going to keep sending you updates, so sort of direct to my team, keep sending this person updates, keep sort of informing them of the risk they're in, because again, this was in the case of like, hey, they are there for personal travel, so we don't necessarily have the authority to say, leave the country now. What we did in the background was start engaging with different internal stakeholders across the mobility team, travel management teams, just getting things in place and going like, hey, we reckon this is going to go. Have we got potentially an armoured transport provider in the country? Have we got any way to get them alternate flights or move them to a different country? What are the ferries looking like? And we were providing these general intelligence updates as well, like here is the current status of transport options, here are some alternate routes to get out of the country, all the kind of standard things that are going to be useful in that planning. Lo and behold, 2 days later, same employee emailed me saying, yeah, all my transport's been cancelled, can you please help me? We obviously didn't rub it in his face, we were there to support, but it was a very, very good thing because he already knew, like, hey, these guys are already looking at it, and it was like, without him coming to us first, we'd already reached out and said, like, hey, we're here, we can support as need to, let us know if you get in dramas. So a really good example of that kind of proactive threat identification, both for support to the traveller, but also to get the plans in place, because when that balloon went up, we were all set. We knew what we were going to do. We knew who we had to engage with, and so did all the different stakeholders. Obviously, it's just one person, though. It gets slightly more difficult when you've got more. So, talking about enhanced decision-making, and I can find my notes in the right place. Ultimately, the key function of intelligence is to inform decision-makers. This is all going to lead to this kind of intelligence-led approach is going to lead to having a better understanding of context for these areas you're looking at. Should we be travelling here? Is there a difference from one city to the next? How do we need to actually plan against the value of a trip versus the potential risk to a person? And how can we inform up to sort of C-suite level of what's particularly going on in an area and why those decisions have been made? With persistent sort of ongoing monitoring as well, that can be a pretty dynamic and ongoing process, and sort of red lines can be established of like, hey, if we hit this trigger event, this is when we start need to have a conversation here. Escalation pathways for changing travel guidance can be brought in from there. And this, it all kind of factors into that real-time situational awareness. And this can be either through, as I said, that constant change in context, that situational awareness, through to updates going to the travellers on the ground, as I said earlier, like, hey, maybe avoid this area, or we've kind of put in a no-go zone here, or whatever it might be. And I think a really good example of this, and excuse my mistake, I did mean the 2025 wildfires. I still don't know where 2024 has gone. So this was a really recent example that many of our embedded teams had to deal with. We have a number of tech clients, obviously very heavily focused in California. And when we're looking at incident response, wildfires, active shooters, tornadoes, they are generally always those events which need that very quick turnaround. They need messaging out very quickly because they are going to generally be over and done with in a short time. Obviously, in the case of the LA wildfires this year, we saw that they were more persistent. The real-time monitoring we had here enabled us rather, to provide assessment of likely direction of fire, how wind speed was affecting, what the current emergency services response to it, to be able to get ahead and say, okay, the likely next evacuation zone is here, so let's start getting messaging out to these people and inform them. It also enables us to have a scaled response sort of on a almost hour by hour sequence, so we can go, okay, we have responses and support and enablement from everything up to person who has been evacuated, potentially lost home or even worse, through to people who are slightly further away, potentially will be evacuated, what they need to know, all the way over to, hey, you are just in LA, so let's provide you resources on air quality and also mental well-being. So we've had that full spectrum response and could kind of deploy that as we were going through based on that kind of travel. What we also found with a lot of clients is the ability to cut through the noise of everything that was in mainstream media and just go, you have these fires, you have these people here, this is where the likely fires are going, this is how many people are impacted. That very simple bite-sized look at what was going on was really appreciated as well. And sort of my final point before I talk a little bit more on how we show this value is on targeted risk mitigation. And I will talk more to this as I go into the next slide, but really this is about focusing resources on where it's needed. I think kind of again, sort of building off of the sort of what Nick spoke about in the example, a first-time traveller going to Kenya during potential election season is going to need more support and more tailored assessment than a regular traveller to New York or London. Obviously, both are going to need, and we would always look to provide intelligence support to both, but the latter is more likely to be, hey, advice on travel disruptions, criminality, whatever it may be, whereas that first-time traveller to Kenya, well, there's the question of, A, do they need to go at that particular time? But if they do, how can we support them? How can we inform them beforehand and provide a very tailored assessment to the environment that they're going into? So all of that's well and good. Intelligence-led approach is a good thing to have. Informed means armed, as I've said. But as with everything, there is cost associated with that. And be that from, as I said, single report to support a specific bit of travel through to an entire embedded travel security team or whatever it may be. So how do we actually justify this to our clients? And this is something Sibylline has to do as well when we're looking at our embedded teams. How do we justify it to our clients in terms of cost and time? How do we show that continued value from forecasting and effectively something that is pretty intangible in terms of predictive analysis, where the goal is to either be prepared or prevent these incidents from happening and prevent going into crisis mode? So the first thing is return on investment. In a simple cost mechanic, over time you will see costs saved from not having to respond to events, and be that not paying higher insurance premiums, not having to spin up crisis response, not having to get people out of country. These things can all lead to cost over time. And through the course of using an intelligence program, metrics and anecdotal case studies can be developed to show this. When we're working with new clients, one of the things I always tend to do as well is we might come in and say, yeah, we know what you kind of need here. You're going to need sort of 2 people on per shift. That means you need X many people. We might go in with a more scalable option. Procurement teams tend to get scared if I go in with large, big figures, so we sort of give them the almost gold, silver, bronze solutions. Obviously, we're always aiming for the gold. We always want to look at, this is going to answer all your requirements, but we look for that sort of scale approach and how we can build it in over time. So that's another aspect to consider. Like, the answer doesn't necessarily have to be, hey, you need an entire intelligence program to support your travel security. It could be, for your higher risk travel, have you looked at potentially utilizing intelligence products to provide a more tailored assessment and enhancing your understanding of risk and threat? Sorry, and I've just lost my point on my notes, which is always a good point there. So traveller assurance is the next thing, and I think, again, Nick sort of alluded to this in his talk earlier. So providing that additional support and intelligence, and I'm thinking in terms of giving pre-briefs to travellers so they have a more in-depth understanding of what they're doing. This can support reputationally, both internally and externally. Externally, yeah, providing support for employees, being very risk-aware when it comes to travel. Internally as well, someone who is going to potentially one of those higher-risk locations, depending on their background, and this is something I used to say to my teams when we were sending messages out, this might be some of scariest things they've had to do. They might be really concerned about this. So that additional support that can be provided is all going to enhance that internal reputation of the team. Anecdotally, and I do say anecdotally, I base this on sort of feedback we've seen from travellers as well. If we've gone through this intelligence-led approach, provided them this support, they know they have potentially a team to reach out to 24/7 if they've got any problems, they know they're going to get alerted if there's any updates, they're going to be more productive on that trip than rather looking over their shoulder of the next bad thing that might happen. There's also a factor here of operational continuity as well. Having the intelligence-led approach, understanding the specific risk environment may enable a client to either remove themselves from a situation before it worsens, continue operating in an area when other competitors potentially can't or won't accept that particular risk or are unable to manage it. So it can support in that way as well. And then finally, talking about benchmarking. Providing intelligence in this way, it can be a very tailored approach. I think in the case of like providing one-off single reports, yes, they're going to be a little bit more, I don't want to say generic, but they're going to be focused on that specific event. With an actual intelligence program supporting travel security, you will have intelligence analysts who understand business impact, business operations, where your travellers are going, what they're trying to achieve. This is going to lead to really unique and developed insights that are going to support travel risk management. I think the kind of point I'll say as well is this isn't a passing fad like throwing intelligence into these things. Obviously, anyone with a military intelligence background, this is something we've done for a period of time. We're seeing it across the broader industry, both in travel security and broader sort of security and corporate intelligence programs. We're seeing airlines having an intelligence-led approach to how they are risk managing both pre-flight, during flight, and on landing. Hotel groups as well are regularly using an intelligence-led approach and often, as something we'll talk to later, leveraging AI to support that analysis as well. This could ultimately give clients competitive advantage and, as I said, the ability to operate where others can't or won't because they don't understand the dynamics and the context of the situation. Having access to proprietary intelligence, whether through tailored reporting that's coming out to support specifically an in-house team, an embedded solution, whatever it is, this is going to give any client an edge over their competitors who are not using data analysis and predictive analysis. This is not only going to drive real-time decision-making, as I said, but it's also going to position any organization as an innovator in security and travel programming. With that, I'll now hand over to Sasha, and she's going to talk more specifically about how intelligence can actually be incorporated into travel security programming.
Great, thank you so much, Luke. And to the audience member who also has the orange nails who've gone fluorescent, mine have as well. So if the speech doesn't leave a lasting impression, hopefully the nails do. But yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. My name's Sasha, and as Luke mentioned, I'm currently embedded with one of Sibylline's clients, a global Fortune 500 company. So I've been there for over 4 years now, and I currently lead the EMEA Global Intelligence and Threat Analyst team. So I'm going to talk to you all today about 3 sort of key focal points. I'm going to talk to you about how intelligence can be wrapped into travel security programs, how strategic reporting can inform travel decisions, and then I'll finish up with some case studies and examples. So I just want to start by sort of caveating that the intelligence produced by embedded teams is often part of a much wider service offering. We're catering to a number of diverse sort of internal stakeholders with our client, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I will focus on how we can particularly support our travel security partners. The real value of intelligence in travel security programs is the granularity and the context that it can provide. Government guidance is normally generic, whereas the key advantage of an intelligence-led approach is the deep understanding that teams will have of the end user, enabling us to provide information specific to the business needs. And that's something that, Nick, you're very much focused on as well in your talk. Our understanding of the client's risk exposure during their trip allows us to move away from security risk ratings at the country level, which, as we know, is how most agencies classify risk, to provide a focused assessment of risks on a local level, from the cities down to neighbourhoods and sometimes down to specific streets. One of the primary value adds of intelligence is the ability to analyse risk with a much broader context. To give an example of where data can be misleading without further analysis behind it, we can look at the Conflict Index published by ACLED, a crisis mapping initiative. The index ranks Colombia as extreme for conflict risk in December 2024, placing it 10th in the world shortly after Lebanon and Sudan. On its own, the data gives a very bleak picture and suggests that Colombia could be considered as a high-risk country for travel. However, further evaluation presents a very different picture and shows us that very few incidents of political violence actually occur in the capital, which is where most travellers will likely be visiting. The vast majority would concentrate in border areas near to Venezuela and Ecuador and would not likely impact business travel to major cities. So a deeper analysis at a more tactical level is crucial in allowing us to interpret data and to translate that into more granular risk scores in order to remove ambiguity. Moving on to how intelligence can be used to assess both static risk and risk in transit. Building a risk profile down to the neighbourhood or the street level is particularly important when it comes to decision-making around reducing risk to travellers in transit. Intelligence analysis can complement travel security's planning by evaluating threats to vehicles along specific routes. So our assessments that we'll produce will focus on which roads report carjackings, what time of day these risks are most elevated, whether we're seeing an increase in smash and grabs when vehicles stop at traffic lights, and also what types of vehicles themselves are actually being targeted. The importance of these insights is highlighted by the example of Cape Town, South Africa, where you may be aware of this already. Several tourists were shot in 2023 after GPS navigation rerouted them through the Cape Flats in order to avoid motorway traffic when they were driving out of the airport. There are routes to and from the airport that are generally considered safer and those that are also considered less safe, but GPS navigation doesn't always take this into account, sometimes prioritizing the fastest route instead of the safest one. So that's where we can come in to really offer those insights about where we think travelers should be going, which routes they should be avoiding. Travel security experts can also incorporate open source intelligence into their pre-travel planning by factoring in risk to key locations such as the hotels themselves. So our Sibylline analyst team embedded with the client will research historic security incidents at a particular hotel, look at online commentary on security measures there, and also consider any local customs to give our travel security partners foresight prior to their meetings with hotel security managers or their site visits. One thing we typically research is a hotel entrance, as an entrance located inside a mall or linked to a casino or a metro station can likely be publicly accessed and would have a higher footfall outside, increasing its profile as a soft target for terrorism. So that's how intelligence can be wrapped into travel security programs. And I'm now going to touch on how strategic reporting can be used to preempt, predict, and prevent informing travel decisions. Ultimately, what our team is trying to do is to reduce or transfer risks posed to the client by identifying potential threats and forecasting their likelihood. One of the main things we'll consider is key dates and flashpoints that could result in a deterioration in the security environment. These include upcoming elections to identify patterns of possible electoral violence, any unrest risks, notable trial dates, commemorative or anniversary dates, religious festivals, and even periods of elevated natural disaster risk. We can also help prevent and predict threats through pattern analysis. So taking the example of Israel, there's typically an uptick in clashes and security incidents every year, roughly between March and May, when a number of religious and national holidays coincide, including Passover, Easter, and Ramadan. Sensitivities during this period mean that the security environment is more volatile and intercommunal tensions are higher, so isolated events then have a greater potential to trigger broader escalations. So if we continue with that example, it's not to say that corporate travellers can't visit Israel during this period, but we'd want to ensure it's on travel security's radar and work with them closely to monitor flashpoints during the dates of travel. Moving on to scenario planning, this has proven to be one of the most interesting areas of the job I found, and more pertinent recently as well with the kinds of geopolitical risks that we're seeing today. By planning for a range of possible outcomes and assessing their likelihood in advance, travel security consultants can use the foresight that we provide to build out robust mitigations and operational plans instead of responding reactively in a crisis. So something that, Luke, you were very much talking about earlier. So the intelligence that our embedded team produces is used to support the client's operational decisions around whether the travel will go ahead, whether secure transport is required, whether we'll be relocating travellers from one part of a city to another, or potentially evacuating them entirely, depending on the security environment. Tom will speak to scenario planning a little later in his portion of the presentation, and I'll also give an example shortly when I walk through a case study. But in our experience, the most effective scenario planning assesses against a range of uncertainties. So we're not just considering the most likely and the least likely outcomes, we're also incorporating considerations around disruption, timeframe, and geographic scope. Once we've forecasted our scenarios, we can work with stakeholders to understand the client's risk appetite and to then identify triggers, which will work in parallel with operational plans. In other words, if we research ahead of time what developments we'd need to see for us to assess that we're moving towards a new phase or a scenario, then we can sort of flag that to our travel security partners and enable them to deploy their operational plans and give them sort of that scope, that forewarning, so that they can start to prepare. It's important to note that scenario planning is not our way of saying what's going to happen. It's not a case of us saying, if X trigger, then Y outcome will follow. Rather, it's a means for us to test and work through the range of things that might happen in collaboration with key partners to make sure that we're all aligned in our preparedness. I can think of many examples where we've identified triggers, they've been hit, but it hasn't necessarily led to the kind of escalation that we would expect. And it hasn't necessarily led us into our next scenario, because there will always be other forces at play. Alternatively, there are times when you may have to bring your operational plans forward, even if the accompanying scenario isn't actually playing out on the ground, and that's because facts on the ground may be dictating this. So an example might be there's decreasing hotel availability, meaning you have to book out rooms ahead of when you otherwise would have. Moving on to the overlap of the strategic and the tactical, our strategic knowledge informs our understanding of threats during tactical monitoring and response. A broader oversight of how threat actors operate in a particular area and how governments and security services typically respond informs our ability to quickly contextualize developments as they arise in real time. This means that we're rarely actually analyzing tactical reports in isolation, but looking to understand whether they're part of the status quo or whether they represent a change in the broader security outlook. This is the so what element that our teams can ultimately bring that's so valuable to our internal stakeholders and especially to our travel security partners. So I'll finish up with some case studies and examples, and the first one that I want to touch on are the challenges of remote working. So it's hard to believe that COVID was half a decade ago, but its remote work legacy presents an evolving problem for travel security teams, as it prompts questions around whether a company's duty of care extends to employees working temporarily from their home country and also to those who may be on personal travel. Nick, I know this is also what you were touching on earlier. So this is an issue that we had to address with a client recently when tensions between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah escalated rapidly back in August of last year. A number of employees were working remotely from Lebanon when governments began urging foreign nationals to leave the country. Our team only found out about their presence there once there was a real need to start centralizing this information in the face of evolving threats. As a result of our preparation and collaboration with travel security and crisis management, the client was able to ensure that all employees had safely left Lebanon before the start of Israel's ground offensive, and I'll quickly talk through how we achieved this. At the time, there was complete uncertainty around how extensive potential military operations would be, or if they would occur at all. So we stood up planning for all outcomes as part of a structured approach. The scenarios we identified ranged from a diplomatic solution to an aerial campaign by both sides to an Israeli ground operation into southern Lebanon. We then focused our intelligence collection to enable our travel security partners to build out their response plans proactively, looking at several key areas. Firstly, we worked out which employees in Lebanon were in the highest risk areas in the event of a conflict escalation by mapping out their locations against Hezbollah strongholds. We assessed that the priority was to relocate employees in southern Lebanon south of the Litani River, due to this area being the likely focus of a potential Israeli ground offensive. We also assessed that the greatest risk to employees in Beirut from airstrikes was in the city's southern suburbs. Travel security's other main area of concern was the possibility of Beirut's international airport becoming non-operational or Lebanese airspace closing entirely if the security environment were to further deteriorate, as options for travelers looking to leave would be severely restricted from this point onwards. We saw key indicators of this being met, namely airline cancellations and embassy guidance to their civilians to leave the country. Given the unpredictability of the situation and the lack of viable contingency plans, we worked with the client to change their company messaging to employees from a recommendation to depart to a much more assertive posture. As a result of this, everyone got out the country safely, and through continued monitoring, we've been able to advise the client on how those risks have stabilized and how they factor more broadly into regional risks today. So I'll just finish up by touching on traveller profiles. Nick, you may also have slightly stolen my thunder there, but it's fine. I think, as Rick, you said, there's a lot of overlap between all of us, which is good. And Luke was also touching on this a little earlier as well. So at the start of this presentation, I spoke about the value of intelligence in adding granularity to risk ratings. But I want to finish by arguing that an intelligence-led approach is the only way to holistically evaluate travel risk because it overlays location risk with risk to the individual. Tailoring risk assessments allows us to offer insights into the varied experiences travelers may have based on their gender, ethnicity, sexuality, medical history, and whether they're a domestic traveler who speaks the language or a foreign national. For example, travel security experts may want to consider briefing female travelers to Delhi due to the particular risks that they face when commuting on public transport and in cabs, especially during evening hours, compared to their commute risks in other countries. Additionally, the recent killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, which I know we've already discussed, highlighted risks to high-profile travelers and executives based on their exposure. So intelligence teams can analyze social media sentiment towards individuals and also assess developments globally to assess how that could possibly increase targeted threats to them. So I'll leave you all with this. I really want to sort of emphasize that risk assessments tailored to the traveler are the next big challenge that travel security programs need to think about. There's currently no automated solution to this, and it becomes particularly difficult for larger companies with thousands of travelers all over the world each year to continue providing that bespoke guidance that's so needed. So thank you so much, and I'll now hand over to Tom to talk through travel risk management.
Thank you very much, Sasha. I'm going to have to sadly start with the same apology which Nick has. My throat is a bit sore, so apologies if there is some coughing involved in there. I'm following 3 extremely detailed talks and excellent ones, in all due respect. So if there is any overlap, again, another apology, but thank you very much. So a travel risk program, there's no perfect science at all to it. There's complex and there's a load of details which we all need to encompass for. But there are opportunities to take the necessary steps to allow for effective mitigation measures. Within these measures, there are core principles and components which I feel that all intelligence-led programs should really keep in mind and focus on. Preparation is critical. It's the most important part in my eyes, which I see for a TRM program. At least 75% of TRM can be planned, trained, and monitored to minimize the impact of possible events. You'll see points 1 to 5, the majority can be bundled all into preparation. And the neat graphic over there as well, the proactive side is what we really want to focus on as an intelligence-led provider. The only reactive side is when an incident happens. And by the time an incident happens, you have your mitigation measures or your treatment measures in place where the impact will be limited. Secondly, there's a customized risk approach. Sasha and Nick have both commented on this. Different travelers and different companies face different risks. TRM should be heavily aligned with their profiles and their risk tolerance. And there's no other way forward with that. It's something which I'll touch on a bit later on as well with client exposure. The way which we see risk today is complex, it's dynamic. There is a dynamic threat environment. Risk factors evolve, so continuous monitoring and real-time intelligence are essential for a well-informed program. I usually would take a deep dive into the threat landscape at least a month before and really have a better understanding of what's going on. It's something which I'll touch on again a bit later. And then, linking back to the reactive side, instant response is the last line of defense. A well-prepared TRM program reduces the need for response. You have your mitigation measures in place. You have those on the ground you know to contact to. It should be a very fluid process once an incident actually takes place. And ultimately, it reduces the possible impacts on a business if there is an effective TRM program, whether that be financially, reputationally. Businesses have the duty of care to look after their employees, so having an appropriate TRM program in place is essential. And finally, looking at some of the principles, security is a continuous cycle. TRM is an ongoing process that should be reviewed, refined, and improved based on feedback. We are the consultant, and we need to understand what the client's needs are specifically. We're not going to come in and tell, as Nick alluded to, your program is wrong or incorrect, but it's an iterative approach. We need to learn just as much from the way which the business model operates to on the ground, and what is your risk profile and your tolerance in that respect. Okay, please excuse some of the quite gimmicky images. It's the best we had in the depository. So the strategic informs the tactical. This is something which we've all spoken about. Some of my colleagues call it the stractical, which might be easier for some of you guys to remember. But it's important not just to look at the city level. You've got to look at the countrywide, and you've got to look at the regional dynamics. Without the macro, the micro becomes a bit less intuitive to that degree. So within that, I had a recent example in that when I had a company who was traveling to Istanbul. And obviously the immediate response is to take a deep dive into the security landscape of Istanbul. But there are bigger factors at play here. You've got to look at the countrywide and then take a step back. And one of the main kind of keys to looking towards this is the triggers, warnings, and indicators. It is usually something which takes place almost outside of the country, which can have a massive impact on the micro. So we went back, we used ACLID as well, which Sasha mentioned, and looked at the spikes over the course of the year when there was an uptick in domestic unrest. And we could ascertain that one example was when there was an assassination of Hamas's senior leadership. That would often result in a huge uptick in pro-Palestinian protests in Istanbul. And as the intelligence provider and those operating on the ground, you are able to read the headlines and be able to react to this a lot quicker than you usually would. And then proper intelligence would then tell you, these are the hotspots for locations. You've seen there's just been a strike in Gaza or something, and there's been a target on Hamas's senior leadership. You can then react saying, these are where the locations, there's a potential for protests. That's that. And then understanding the security landscape, this kind of goes without saying. This must be the obsession for the analyst. And as I referred to beforehand, it often takes about a month of monitoring beforehand. But what to look for, again, it depends what the client exposure is, but this is going in and breaking down the threat actors which operate there. But it's breaking them down through the tactics, techniques, and procedures. If it's a climate activist group, it's looking at the propensity to violence. So say if a company has got an AGM in Australia, you're breaking down every single group which operates there. So if there is a mention of the client knows who the group is, the way they operate, and the propensity to violence, and then you are able to make the necessary mitigation plans or treatment measures if there are protests. And thirdly, client exposure, it goes down to, there's obviously indirect and direct spillover risk for the client. So it's important to understand who the client is. Say if they've been tied towards unfavorable climate practices, then they'll render them more susceptible to climate activism. So then you're going to pay a bit more attention to climate activism. Say if they've had links with Israel's defense sector, then we're looking at pro-Palestinian activism. So it's really trying to break down their business model, understand who they're about, and where their risk tolerance essentially lies on the scale. I think it's all important to know, particularly with this side, that TRM, it's challenging, and I think it's become more challenging over the last few years. The way in which risk has manifested itself, it's gone beyond just organised crime, spillover risk from theatres of war. There's online disinformation and misinformation, which has the way in which individuals are radicalised through alternative social medias, deep and dark web. We've obviously referred to the United Healthcare incident. The way in which that assassination has been celebrated by left-wing groups is worrying. And I think a more holistic and a rounded intelligence approach to TRM must encompass this online chatter, is utilising deep and dark web tools, because this is ultimately the most targeted forum which risk can manifest itself. So it's added another dynamic to TRM, which, as intelligence providers, you have to take into account beforehand. Clear and timely communications. This is not just intelligence. This is not just intelligence within TRM. This is intelligence as a whole. There has to be there has to be clear lines of communication on the ground. So if an incident does happen, you know about the respective stakeholders that you got a message instantly. And it is beneficial. Well, I've had a couple of TRM programs before where you don't necessarily get as much information off the client which you need. I think it's important that the more granular the granular information which a client can give, the more granular the intelligence can be. This is why it's an iterative approach. You're constantly learning with it. And the more information that a client can provide, the better the intelligence can be, and that's really important. No surprises is, yes, Sasha has definitely stolen my thunder on this one. This is essentially looking at scenarios. It's looking at the low probability, high impact scenarios. So as and when something goes horribly wrong, you've had it covered. And that takes a few things. It takes an understanding of the security landscape to understand the proper the triggers for a very disruptive event. But it also encompasses the stractical or the strategic and the tactical. So that's where the macro and the micro, or the zoom out to zoom in, must be encompassed during it. And finally, utilizing available technology. I think we're in the day and age now where we're all aware that there are incidental monitoring tools, there are social media skimming tools. I think it's important to make sure you know which ones are best for your company and which ones actually fit the bill and can perform the function which they say they do. A lot of them will sprinkle AI on it and kind of hope it works, which is not always the case. But I think don't necessarily also be overly reliant on technology. I think as analysts, you should trust your instinct and your gut when it comes to understanding a region. And it is often that feeling which will give you the best scenarios and the best feedback and forecasting. It's because you've studied a region for as many years as you have. That's all from us. So I'll hand over back to Luke to give how Sibylline does it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and thank you everyone for your attention. We will turn over to questions from the audience, but I just want to leave our slide with only our details up, how we can potentially help. And as I said, please do come and chat to us during the networking break, and we have our client engagement team with us here today as well. But with that, please, I'll hand over to Rick and to any questions from the floor.
Any questions from the floor? I have a lot of questions, but I want to save a lot of these for the panel. But one, I think, Tom, what you've just talked about, AI, right? We had a webinar on AI. One of the key points that came out of that last week was trust AI less than you trust people. So how are you oh, thanks.
Only for the online.
For the online. Sorry. Yeah. So. Andrew Tollington told us that, trust AI less than you trust people. So how is AI making your life easier, and how is it making it more difficult?
Good question. I think AI is on the tip of everyone's tongue at the moment. And I think we would be out of a job if people trusted AI more than humans, so I'm delighted that there is still that human instinct, and keeping people safe, I'd like to think, is a very human thing to do. So we don't want to put all the trust in AI. But in terms, I think the core component which AI can facilitate is efficiency. It's breaking down big data sets and incorporating those into your, you can incorporate into the forecasting. So Sibylline have used in Israel's strike dashboard, which encompasses AI and kind of looks to forecast where the next strikes might be in between Israel and Gaza. So it's a harmony. It's obviously not taking it for complete granted, but it's also utilising it to improve efficiency and forecasting.
Oh, I think that's the key, increasing efficiency, absolutely. But then, Sasha, misinformation was listed, and there are a lot of threat actors using these platforms now to create misinformation. So how do you mitigate with that?
Definitely. I think it's really pushed us to focus more on the other tools that we have available to try and sort of double check and fact check. We've really got to be looking at sort of reverse image searches, trying to find the source of these images if they haven't been published before, or if they're just sort of, often you'll find, particularly during conflict, there's actors trying to take advantage of that to create sort of that sentiment against one side or the other. And so you've really got to try and find out. Often you'll be sort of seeing images of strikes that have hit a city or something, actually from 10 years ago, rocket impacts in Tel Aviv from 10 years ago that would be being resurfaced just by sort of nefarious actors now to try and sort of claim that they've carried out another strike, or to try and create confusion, disruption, misinformation within a city to try and cause panic. So that really makes our job difficult when we're sort of getting all this imagery really out of a city to suggest something's happened. So it's just really relying on the tools that we've got, sort of language translations we've really got to rely on. We don't speak all the languages in the world, but we've got tools that can help us to do that, and we really we can't take anything that we see for granted. So it makes everything a lot longer.
BBC has an Authenticate lead, you know, BBC Authenticate, where they will analyse impact areas to check that the footage actually is where they say the hospital in Gaza was one of those that they really played on and proved that missiles had come from the Gazan side and not from IDF. So how much of your credibility lies within the ability for your clients to be able to authenticate your information? Do you get asked for authentication of the intelligence you're providing?
Definitely, because a lot of the time the information that we're providing is going up. It depends on the severity of the incident, but it could be going up to the C-suite, so we have to be able to answer for everything that we've said. So if there's any element of doubt, we do have to, as intelligence analysts, make that really clear. We're not going to necessarily know something straight from the outset. If the information isn't there to let us know that, we can make our best guess, but we have to be really clear about that, because the worst thing you can sort of do when you're consulting for the client is tell them something and then have to backtrack. Your reputation, they say it takes years to build up, seconds to crumble, so we can't really afford to have that credibility undermined.
Yeah, absolutely. We will close off there. Last round of applause for all of our speakers in this first session.